Donde sea que vayas, ganas puntos como un pro con la nueva tarjeta American Express de My Lowe's Pro Rewards. En compras elegibles gana 3 puntos por cada $1 en Lowe's durante los primeros 6 meses después de abrir una cuenta. Además, gana puntos donde acepten la tarjeta American Express. Aprovecha hoy. Sujeto a aprobación de crédito. Aplican exclusiones y restricciones. Puntos sujetos a términos del programa de lealtad en Lowe's.com/terms y términos de recompensas de crédito en Synchrony.com/MLBRA-terms. Detalles en Lowe's.com/business credit.
Hey listeners, this is Peter and welcome back to the History Shorts. Today's episode is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world. Download Podcast Republic today, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. For 9 centuries, people have been searching for the Holy Grail. Knights crossed Europe for it. Crusaders believed they were fighting toward it. Medieval kings commissioned quests for it, and Heinrich Himmler sent SS expeditions to find it. Indiana Jones even chased it across 3 continents. And in the Cathedral of Valencia in Spain, a stone cup sits behind bulletproof glass, venerated by millions, endorsed by multiple popes, and officially proposed by its custodians as the actual cup used by Jesus Christ at the Last Supper. The Holy Grail is the most searched for object in Western history. It is also, by the best available historical evidence, a literary invention that first appeared in an unfinished French Romance poem written about 1190 AD. Our history brief today introduces a new segment called History versus Hollywood, or Hollywood versus History. A quick word from our sponsors.
Support for the show comes from Public, the investing platform for those who take it seriously. On Public, you can build a multi-asset portfolio of stocks, bonds, options, crypto, and now generated assets, which allow you to turn any idea into an investable index with AI. It all starts with your prompt. From renewable energy companies with high free cash flow to semiconductor suppliers growing revenue over 20% year over year, you can literally type any prompt and put the AI to work. It screens thousands of stocks, builds a one-of-a-kind index, and lets you backtest it against the S&P 500. Then you can invest in a few clicks. Generated assets are like ETFs with infinite possibilities, completely customizable and based on your thesis, not someone else's. Go to public.com/podcast and earn an uncapped 1% bonus when you transfer your portfolio. That's public.com/podcast. Paid for by Public Investing. Brokerage services by Open to the Public Investing Inc. Member FINRA and SIPC. Advisory services by Public Advisors LLC, SEC registered advisor. Generated assets is an interactive analysis tool. Output is for informational purposes only and is not an investment recommendation or advice. Complete disclosures available at public.com/disclosures.
This day in history. On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law, paving the way for the forced relocation of Native American nations in one of the darkest chapters of American expansion. Story of the day. The first thing to understand about the Grail is that it does not appear at all in the Bible. Not in the Gospels, not in the Acts of the Apostles, not anywhere in the canon Christian scripture. The Last Supper is described in all 4 Gospels. The cup used at that meal is mentioned in just 3 of them. But none of the Gospel writers describe what happened to that cup afterward, what it looked like, where it went, or whether it had any special properties. The theological significance of the Eucharist, the ritual reenactment of the Last Supper that became central to Christian practice, did not depend on the physical survival of the original cup. The cup itself was simply not a subject of early Christian interest. The Grail legend begins, as far as scholars can determine and as far as I could find on the internet, with a French poet named Crétin de Troyes. Around 1190 AD, Crétin began writing a romance called Percival, or the story of the Grail, a tale of knightly adventure set in the world of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. In this story, the hero Percival visits a mysterious castle and witnesses a strange procession. A young man carrying a bleeding lance, and a young woman carrying a glowing vessel called the Grail. The word Graal in Old French simply meant a wide, shallow serving dish. It was not explicitly identified as the cup of the Last Supper. It was a magical object, associated with abundance, with healing, with mysterious power, but its precise nature was left quite ambiguous. Creighton never finished the poem. He died leaving Percival incomplete. And in that incompleteness, in the unanswered questions, the unexplained mystery, he accidentally created one of the most generative narrative gaps in the history of Western literature. Other writers naturally rushed to fill it. Over the following decades and centuries, multiple authors wrote continuations and elaborations of the story. Each added new elements. The Graal became explicitly identified as the cup of the Last Supper. It acquired the power to heal wounds, sustain life, and grant visions of the divine. The quest for it became the supreme spiritual undertaking of any Arthurian knighthood. The German poet Wilhelm von Eschenbach, writing around 1210, transformed it into a magical stone with the power to grant immortality. The 13th century French prose cycle, known as the Lancelot Grail, made the search for the Grail the central narrative of the King Arthur's world and introduced the idea that only a knight of perfect spiritual purity or gallant could achieve it. By the time Thomas Malory compiled his great English synthesis in the 15th century that described the story of King Arthur, the Grail had become exactly what most people today think it always was: a sacred cup of Christ, hidden somewhere in the world, awaiting a worthy seeker. The legend had taken less than 3 centuries to construct itself essentially from nothing. Once the legend existed, people began looking for the object that it described. This is one of the more remarkable phenomena in the history of human belief: the transformation of a literary invention into a historical artifact that people were willing to really die seeking. Medieval Christendom produced a thriving trade in religious relics: pieces of the true cross, or bones of saints, thorns from the crown of thorns, and the cup of the Last Supper was the most prestigious relic conceivable. Multiple objects were proposed and then venerated. The Santo Cáliz, the Holy Chalice in the Cathedral of Valencia, is the most serious candidate. It is a 1st century Middle Eastern cup, mounted in a medieval golden base. It was held at a monastery in Aragon from at least the 11th century. Several medieval popes used it to celebrate Mass. Pope John Paul II celebrated Mass with it in Valencia in 1982. Pope Benedict XVI celebrated Mass with it in 2006. The cup itself is generally ancient, a 1st century drinking vessel of the type that would have been in use in Roman era Judea. Whether it is the cup used at the Last Supper is a question that archaeology and history still cannot answer. There is no documented provenance connecting it to Jerusalem before the medieval period. Its supporters point to its age and its ancient origin, but its critics point to the absence of any chain of custody reaching back to that 1st century. The Church has never made an official declaration that it is indeed the authentic Grail. It has simply allowed the veneration, and the popes have continued to celebrate Mass with it. The 12th century produced its own Grail seekers, some of them considerably more alarming than medieval knights. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and one of the architects of the Holocaust, was genuinely obsessed with the occult and with Germanic mythology, including the Grail legend as filtered through Wagner's opera. He dispatched an expedition to France in 1944 to a ruined Cathar fortress associated in some traditions with the Grail, looking for the very object. Of course, he found nothing. The Nazis' occult obsessions are sometimes treated as comic, the Indiana Jones version of history, you might say, But they were not comic. They were the mystical dimension of generally murderous ideology. And they ended the same way that the ideology did, in rubble. The History Brief. Today, on some Hollywood versus history, I decided to start this new thing. Why not? Few historical films have shaped public memory quite like Braveheart. Released in 1995 and directed by and starring Mel Gibson, the movie turned William Wallace into a global symbol of freedom and rebellion. The movie won 5 Academy Awards. Actually, I forgot that it won that many. I looked it up and I was like, wow, okay. It also inspired tourism to Scotland and gave audiences one of cinema's most iconic battle cries. We've all heard it. They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom. There's just one problem, historically speaking, that is. Braveheart is wildly inaccurate. So I decided to Google what is the movie that probably gets history the most wrong. And this one popped up. So, what's a better way to start this new segment? Let's start with the look at Wallace himself. In the film, Scottish warriors wear kilts and paint their faces blue before battle. It looks fantastic on screen, but it's separated from the real William Wallace by centuries. Wallace lived in the late 1200s. Kilts did not become associated with the Highland culture until hundreds of years later. And the blue face paint was linked to the ancient Picts, who fought the Romans nearly 1,000 years before Wallace's time. And then there's the movie's most famous battle, the Battle of the Stirling Bridge. Historically, the bridge was the entire reason the Scots won in the first place. English forces were forced to cross a narrow wooden bridge, creating a bottleneck that the Scots then exploited brilliantly. But in the movie, there is no bridge at all. Why, you might say? Well, based on what I researched and Googled, reportedly because filming a bridge battle was considered too complicated and expensive, whatever that means. So, one of the medieval Scotland's greatest tactical victories became just another open field charge. And the inaccuracies just keep going. The film portrays Wallace as a humble peasant rising against tyranny. In reality, he was likely a minor nobleman, educated and connected enough to lead military campaigns. Now, that doesn't make him less significant, but it does change the story from the common farmer becomes hero to something more politically complex. And then there's perhaps the biggest historical invention of all of it, Wallace's romance with Princess Isabella of France. That never happened. It's almost as if Hollywood always has to force some kind of a love story into the historical plots. So, yeah, this never happened, not even close. At the time Wallace was executed, which was in 1305, Isabella was probably around 9 years old and still living in France. She hadn't even married the future Edward II yet. The affair and the implication that Wallace may have fathered a future English king is just pure Hollywood fiction. And yet, despite all of this, historians often admit something that's kind of uncomfortable when it comes to these movies. Braveheart still works, and it's still an awesome movie. Because while the facts collapse very quickly, as we just saw, the emotional core resonates. The film captures themes of resistance, identity, sacrifice, and national memory in a way that feels emotionally true, even when historically false. And that kind of raises the big important question. What do we actually want from historical movies? Do we want perfect accuracy? Then perhaps we should watch documentaries. Or do we want emotional storytelling inspired by the past? Well, the truth is, Hollywood rarely recreates history exactly as it happened. It reshapes the past into narratives audiences can immediately understand: heroes versus villains, or freedom and oppression, and triumph and tragedy. Sometimes that inspires curiosity about the real history, and other times it just replaces the real history entirely. So, as long as we know that what we're watching is kind of the idea or the feeling and emotion of the historical event. And if we want to know more about it, we should probably go do the research ourselves. Then we should be fine. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today and helping make this little show such a mighty success. If you're enjoying this show and would like to help with its production, you can always donate a few dollars at buymeacoffee.com or become a Patreon member to enjoy these episodes ad-free. Both links can be found on our website at www.historyshortspodcast.com. And don't forget to check out our YouTube channel, where we have different series that are not part of this main feed. Have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you all again tomorrow.